Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, if you're familiar with our channel, or if you're just joining us for the first time today, chances are that you're familiar with the Bronze Age collapse. Now, we have a whole video about the Bronze Age collapse that you can check out here if you aren't familiar with it, but here's a quick summary. Around 1200 BC, the empires and civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean stopped functioning the way they had been for millennia, and they all fell apart. The Bronze Age empires were replaced by the empires and minor states of the Iron Age, states like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Urartu, and the Syro-Palestinian polities, like the Arameans, Philistines, Israelites, and Phoenician city-states. The Bronze Age collapse set the stage for the Iron Age kingdoms to rise and fall, so understandably it gets a lot of scholarly and popular attention. But there's another collapse-like event in the ancient world that we think deserves some attention, and that's what we're talking about today. This event in the 6th century BC is arguably more influential in the course of world history than the Bronze Age collapse. Today we'll explore the idea of a 6th century collapse, if it's a real thing or not, and some ways that it has impacted history.
Okay, I'll admit before we dive into this theory that it's not a fully formed idea yet, but I'm pretty sure it's a good one, and that I'm working on fully articulating it. I'm also not entirely out on a limb here. Collapse is actually my area of expertise. It's what my dissertation was on, and I've even publicly presented some of these ideas at an academic conference in a co-authored paper, so kind of know some of what I'm talking about. And other scholars I highly regard have written about this too, so I think it's worth getting into it here on this channel. Now, the term collapse has a fairly specific meaning for those who study it. It's different from things like conquest or regime change, and it's a process that is fairly uniform across time and culture, so what we see in the Mayan collapse has commonalities with the end of Rome, and the Bronze Age collapse, and Cahokia, and Chaco Canyon, and so on and so on. Collapse is a largely endogenous process, meaning certain societies develop to a point where they are fragile or susceptible to collapse. External factors may trigger a cascading failure, but such cascading events don't usually happen to otherwise healthy or stable societies. When collapse occurs, there are a variety of characteristics you may see. And different scholars will have different lists of what you may see, but here's my collection of commonalities to collapse events. You'll see things like settlement pattern changes. Existing cities and towns are abandoned and new ones are founded. This results in a reduced built environment, meaning there's little new construction, or fewer and smaller structures, and nearly no monumental architecture. Another characteristic of collapse is a reduction in social stratification. In a collapse, it doesn't matter who your parents are. Traditional elites become less important, and society becomes more meritocratic, until the post-collapse world things become more stratified again, often with a new set of elites that may or may not have any relation to the earlier pre-collapse period. Finally, we often see post-collapse narratives of collapse. In the aftermath of collapse, stories are told about the golden age before the collapse, and typically explanations arise of why collapse befell the society. The works of Lao Tzu and Confucius and the 100 schools of thought during the spring and autumn period and into the Warring States period in China are examples of post-collapse narratives following the collapse of the Zhou dynasty. The competing philosophies of this period shaped Chinese thought for millennia. So don't underestimate the relevance of these post-collapse narratives. Explanations for why things went so wrong and solutions for how to avoid it in the future are understandably pretty relevant even for people today. Now, not everything in this list needs to be present for you to identify an event as collapse. Diagnosing collapse is kind of like a physician diagnosing a disease. A disease may manifest in a number of different ways, and the same disease can even present differently from person to person. Take strep throat, for example. There are some pretty common symptoms of strep throat. Difficulty swallowing, sore throat, fever, those white spots on your throat. If you wake up with those symptoms, you usually know you need to go get an antibiotic. But body aches, nausea, vomiting, headache, and a rash can also be symptoms of strep. You may still have strep and not actually have a common symptom like a sore throat. There's an underlying pathogen that can manifest in many different ways. Just because you may never get a sore throat doesn't mean that you don't have strep throat. It's just that the underlying cause is manifesting differently than you may expect. So just like diseases can manifest differently from person to person, collapse can manifest differently from society to society. To tell if there's collapse or not, you need to look at all of the symptoms and the underlying factors to see if it's collapse or something different. We've previously explored the ways these symptoms were manifest in the Bronze Age collapse. So for our question today, we need to look at our data. What kind of evidence do we have for a 6th century collapse?
Now, just as the Bronze Age collapse occurs in the decades around 1200 BC, the period we're focused on for a 6th century collapse goes from the late 700s to about 550 BC. The terminology and really the idea is best formulated by the historian Mario Leverani, and he calls it the 6th century collapse. We're following his lead here in the terminology department, but this event really encompasses more than the 6th century. So if we had to name it, we'd probably call it something like a long 7th century collapse. Anyway, if you look at the history of this period, and if you listen to historians and archaeologists, what you'll find is that from the late 900s until about 630, the Neo-Assyrian Empire came to dominate the ancient Near Eastern world. The Assyrian Empire was replaced by the Chaldean dynasty of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which was in turn destroyed by the Medes and then the Persians. Then Cyrus the Great asserted Achaemenid Persian dominance over the Medes around 550. Now this is the narrative you see when you read about this period, and it's not wrong. This is what happened, and this narrative is focused on the major regions and political powers of the day. However, it glosses over what happens in some of the peripheral areas, and those areas are where the collapse seems to occur. Now, let's look at what was happening in some of these peripheral areas during the 6th century collapse. Around 675, the Frisian kingdom in central Anatolia was destroyed. This kingdom that had lasted for several centuries came to an end in the 7th century at the hands of a group of migratory steppe people called the Cimmerians. In Syria, several Neo-Hittite polities ended around the same time or a bit before the Frisian kingdom. Most of them ended after unfortunate encounters with Neo-Assyrian kings, mostly Sargon II. These were polities that were established in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, but were destroyed in the late 700s or mid-600s, sometimes after existing as vassals of Assyria for several decades. In Armenia, the kingdom of Urartu had ruled since sometime in the 11th century, or maybe even earlier. This kingdom had an impressive network of mountain fortresses, including a network of beacons, not unlike in The Lord of the Rings. But Sargon II severely weakened the kingdom in the late 700s. Urartu experienced a minor resurgence in the early 7th century, but the tide turned against it again in the mid-7th century. Urartu may have called for aid, but there was no Rohan to answer. In fact, it was actually the steppe civilizations of the Cimmerians and Scythians that again weakened the kingdom. Ultimately, Urartu was destroyed by the Medes in the early 6th century. A similar story played out with the Manaeans, a kingdom in what is now northern Iran and Azerbaijan. These people expanded from their core area but were later weakened by Assyrian aggression and then destroyed by the Medes. In Egypt during this period, there was a resurgence in the Cite dynasty, which kicked off the so-called late period in Egyptian history. This was the last dynasty of native Egyptians to rule before being defeated by the Achaemenid Persian king Cambyses II in 526 or 525. Finally, in the southern Levant, we see the kingdom of Israel destroyed by the Neo-Assyrians in the late 700s. Judah was destroyed in the early 6th century by the Babylonians. Likewise, the Philistines, Moab, Ammon, and Edom all seem to lose autonomy by the 6th century at the hands of either the Assyrians or the Babylonians. The 6th century marks the end of autonomous polities in the southern Levant, and their relegation to vassal status or worse, a state from which many of these societies never fully recovered. So, the history of this period is dominated by these large empires, namely the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire. But the peripheries of these empires were picked off and destroyed one by one. When we look at the places we just went through, we see a lot of them look like they experienced collapse. The question is, was it really collapse, or was it something else?
So, was there a 6th century collapse? No, not exactly, but it looks a lot like it. In fact, the archaeologist Avraham Faust, who I think is right on just about everything, has looked at the archaeology of this period in Judah and says it fits the bill for collapse. If you look at the trait list for collapse and you look at the archaeology of Judah in the 6th century, you would diagnose it as collapse. His most recent book expands a bit on this assessment and broadens the horizon a bit wider to the Assyrian Empire and its southwestern provinces. He makes a compelling case that Assyrian policies and practices resulted in collapse-like conditions in the empire's peripheral areas. This is the pattern you see when you look at the regions we just went through. They exhibit many of the hallmarks of collapse: demographic crises, settlement pattern shifts, and on down the line. They fit the bill. But one distinction indicates that these were not collapse. They are not endogenous events. The end of these societies were all the result of outside forces rather than the collapse of internal structures. The internal structures of these societies did collapse, but not due to structural instability or social upheaval from the inside. Liverani says there is no single cause for the collapse, but they are all linked to the phenomenon of empire. So it seems that the collapse of the long 7th century is not a natural collapse, but instead is a kind of imposed collapse. We can then say the imposition of the conditions of collapse is an epiphenomena of mid to late Iron Age imperial policies of the Assyrian and Babylonian polity.
Okay, so that's some jargony mumbo-jumbo. Academics, am I right? It's the kind of thing that's great in an academic paper, but maybe not helpful to you. What Philip means is that as the empires of Assyria and Babylon expanded, they destroyed and subjugated surrounding kingdoms in such a way that it mimicked the conditions of collapse. They either enacted policies that led to the destruction of these kingdoms, or destruction just happened in the process of waging war against them. The example of Judah is probably the best known to you, and it makes a good case study. When Nebuchadnezzar deported so many Judahites to Babylon, he destroyed the cities of Judah. He devastated the land, and in so doing, he imposed a kind of collapse, or at least the conditions of collapse. Now, one important distinction between structural collapse and this imposed collapse is that in the case of Judah, their elites were removed to Babylon rather than deposed or killed by internal social upheaval. We'll explore these conditions in a minute, but suffice it to say, in the late Iron Age Near East, whether your land prospered or withered was almost entirely up to the whims of the kings of Mesopotamia.
So this 6th century collapse isn't exactly a collapse, at least not in the way the term is used technically by historians and archaeologists. Nevertheless, a number of the peripheral areas that encountered these Mesopotamian empires suffered the conditions of collapse, which were imposed upon them, so we can still talk about a 6th century collapse even if these episodes don't fit the technical definition of a collapse. Why is that important? Well, among many other reasons, it has some pretty big implications for how we read the Bible. Mario Liverani quite rightly says the significance of this collapse is enormous. It remains to be seen how widespread recognition of this collapse episode would impact the interpretation of history and archaeology, but we want to close by focusing again on the example of Judah. Judah may not have had a natural collapse, but as Faust argues, it did experience a kind of collapse, what I call an imposed collapse. It's worth looking at this period of Judahite history through the lens of collapse. And archaeologically, we see a demographic crisis and settlement pattern shifts, as well as a reduction in the built environment and societal simplification. Those are all symptoms of collapse, whether natural or imposed. But I want to highlight another symptom of collapse, the post-collapse narrative making that I talked about earlier. Most scholars recognize that the Hebrew Bible as we know it came together in the period following the Babylonian exile. While there were certainly pre-exilic texts and documents, including some very old ones, it's during the post-exilic period that it all coalesced into the form that we would recognize. The Hebrew Bible was formed in the aftermath of the imposed collapse brought about by the exile, and it may be a worthwhile endeavor to read some of it in light of collapse theory, as a post-collapse narrative of collapse. In the Hebrew Bible, we certainly see explanations of why the Babylonian exile happened. It seeks to address questions like, why would God allow this to happen? It wrestles with the theological implications of the loss of the temple, the loss of the kingship, the loss of Israelite autonomy. These are the questions that the remnant of Israel was wrestling with after the exile, and out of this struggle emerged the Hebrew Bible as we know it.
Now, as I've learned about this theory for myself, I found that reading the entire Hebrew Bible through the lens of post-collapse narrative actually makes a lot of sense. And when you think about what the history that the Hebrew Bible preserves and the ways that it frames Israel's history, it kind of ties everything together. And from the time after Moses leads the Exodus out of Egypt, there are pleas to remain faithful to God alone and warnings about the consequences of unfaithfulness. These warnings are repeated by the great figures of Israel's history, including Moses, Joshua, and Samuel. Even some of the most famous episodes of the Exodus, like Israel's idolatry with the golden calf, seem to be aimed at calling out the unfaithful practices of later kings. We'll explore that one in greater depth in a future video. The book of Judges traces the decline of Israel's faithfulness from strength under Joshua's leadership to internal divisions and succumbing to Philistine influence by the time of Samson. The Israelite monarchy is always portrayed ambivalently, with the people's desire for a king, like the surrounding nations, being condemned by Samuel, although God ultimately grants their request. Israel's kings are never seen as infallible or godlike figures, with even David's sin with Bathsheba being preserved in the annals of Israelite history. The most positive figures in Israel's later history are the prophets, whose warnings of destruction and calls to faithfulness are expounded much more than the accomplishments of any king. The preservation of this prophetic activity makes sense in light of a society grappling with the aftermath of its own destruction. If only we'd listened to the prophets, this wouldn't have happened. Even the earliest stories from Genesis make sense when read as post-collapse literature. Adam, the central figure of God's creation, ends up exiled from the garden for his sin. In fact, scholars believe that the early parts of Genesis were some of the last parts of the Hebrew Bible to be written in their final form, and the lens of post-collapse narrative can help us understand why. The post-exilic communities under Ezra and Nehemiah instituted reforms that focused on the purity of the community and its reliance on God alone. They even took extreme measures like forcing Israelite men to divorce non-Israelite women. We see in the post-exilic community an emphasis on the themes that run throughout the Hebrew Bible. Now, all these threads, the warnings against unfaithfulness and its consequences, the ambivalence about the monarchy, the elevation of the prophetic tradition, they all make the most sense to me as responses to the struggle of Israel in a new post-collapse reality. They turn to the stories of their past and the fulfillment of the prophet's warnings in hopes of finding a way to understand their present and to chart a way forward into a different future. And that brings us to a final thread in the Hebrew Bible that I don't think we can miss. Even among the doom and gloom that clouds much of Israel's written history, there's an overtone of hope throughout the Hebrew Bible. Despite Israel's repeated unfaithfulness and the resulting consequences, hope for restoration and renewed faithfulness runs through the story of God's people from beginning to end. The commissions given to Israel by Moses and Joshua promise that if Israel will be faithful to God, God will be faithful and preserve their nation. The prophets, for all their dire warnings, repeat this promise that Israel can be saved if they will turn back to God. Even in texts written in the aftermath of the exile, hope remains that while collapse has happened, all is not lost. Renewed faithfulness to God will bring renewed prosperity to Israel. The rebuilding of Jerusalem, its wall, and its temple by the Ezra-Nehemiah group is the first strain of the remnant of Judah acting on hope instead of succumbing to the finality of collapse. Ancient Israel was a people whose history was defined by collapse. They emerged from the widespread upheaval of the Bronze Age collapse, and they met their end, or at least a fundamental shift in their mode of existence, during the imposition of the 6th century collapse. The chaos of collapse produced the conditions for both their creation and their destruction. As things fell apart, Israel looked back to its origins to understand its present circumstances and to find a way to a new and different future. If you think about it, that's pretty much what we do when we read the Bible today. We look to the stories of God and God's people from the past to understand our present and guide us into the future. If it's unsettling for you to think about the Bible being mostly written after the exile rather than as the events were happening, I think this is a helpful perspective to remember. The Israelites, in writing the Bible, were doing exactly what we do with the Bible today. We also don't doubt that the Hebrew Bible we have today contains source material from much earlier in Israel's history. It's just that the best theory we have is that the Bible we now know was compiled after the exile and shaped by Israel's experience of post-collapse reality. That reality became the lens through which they saw their entire history, and we see evidence of that throughout the Bible itself. I want to close with a more theological turn, which may not be what you came here for, but which is an important part of what we do at Beneath the Bible, and it's important for me personally. It comes back to the theme of hope in the midst of adversity that runs through the Hebrew Bible. The story of Israel and the testimony of the prophets points toward a hope that, at the close of the Old Testament, remains unrealized. Passages like the familiar Jeremiah 29:11 promise hope and a future for God's people. But that hope doesn't come to full fruition even after the exile. Now that's where, as a Christian, I see the arc of the Old Testament pointing toward the hope we find in the coming of Jesus. The prophets anticipated his arrival as the culmination of God's work through God's people, even if they didn't realize its full implications. Jesus embodies the story of Israel itself in perfect obedience to God, where the nation itself had failed. And it's Jesus who gives us hope for the future, regardless of our present circumstances. We may not experience collapse the way the ancient Israelites did, but we all have times in our lives when things fall apart, and we're left wondering how we're going to move forward and rebuild. I think there's something almost comforting in seeing this experience we all have writ large in the story of Israel. When our lives seem to fall apart, whether through our own undoing or through circumstances beyond our control, we have the opportunity to turn to God with renewed faithfulness and the promise of a future with hope. Collapse doesn't have to be the end of the story. With the hope we have in Jesus, it can instead be a new beginning. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked this video, be sure to check out our deep dive on the Bronze Age collapse, the event that led to the emergence of ancient Israel. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Beneath the Bible, and you can support our work at ko-fi.com/beneaththebible. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep digging.